setting out to design the metaverse
Mm-mm. Yeah,
was
go ahead.
was a failure to begin with. Like, you would have been much more effective at setting out to do something like Midjourney in the
Right.
process of creating the metaverse, because that's this thing that people fall into and they fall in love with, and it's almost accidental, right? You're not like, we're going to create a structure and we're going to port people over into the structure,
Right.
and in lockstep we're all going to decide that this is how we're going to live now.
Yeah.
And instead you give them something that is
Mm.
undeniably interesting and
Yeah.
appealing and tasty, and
Yeah.
they will port themselves over to
Mm.
it.
Yeah. I totally agree. Yeah, there's so much we can talk about here. I do, so again, I always studying how change happens, because I like, since I was a teenager, I was like, things should change, but like, and clearly people yelling things should change don't change a lot, right? So it's like, okay, that doesn't work. Like, what does work, right? And yeah, I used to do a lot of, and I still do. I'm always like researching, like, what is the backstory of an idea whose time has come, right? And it does often require, so some set of people who are very persistent and about, like, saying what they say, and living out their principles very visibly. There's a whole bunch of stuff about that, but yeah, it's very rarely grand sweeping projects of like social change, and it's more of like, certain talking points that you want to spread, and you make it as easy as possible for people to spread. First of all, it has to be true in some way. I mean, maybe not like absolutely true, but like true enough that people agree with it and are willing to spread it. And like, you can see, like, there's like this dominoes dropping of certain talking points that start out on blogs, for example, and then eventually they make it into, like, people argue about it on Twitter even. Then eventually it makes it to like mainstream media. It's like it's written into like a TV show that everyone sees, and then it percolates from there. Um,
Well, like the most recently, the Less Wrong arc about
mhm.
AGI, right?
Sure, yeah, yeah,
Where it's
yeah,
like you have a
yes,
community of people that are arguing about the dangers of artificial intelligence,
hmm,
a full decade before it happens,
yeah,
and now you
yeah,
have that they're writing about it in Time magazine,
yeah.
suggesting the bombing of data centers.
You're right. Yeah. So I mean, the lesson there for anyone who is passionate about anything is like, write your stuff down, be consistent about it, talk to as many people as you can about it, and like have the like make sure that your arguments are like accessible. And even less wrong. I don't know if they've done it in the best possible way you can do it, but like, they've done it well enough that we are talking about it right now, right? And
Yeah.
like, yeah, one of my beliefs is that it's possible to, I wouldn't say orchestrate. Like, um you can't know how people will receive some specific thing, and you can't uh predict specific dates of when things are going to happen. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can't predict. But there are things you can do to make it easier for like certain ideas to spread at certain events, for example. So like, you can have something ready to go in response to something else, and knowing that it will happen eventually. Like, major
It's
public figures dying is a common thing. Yeah.
it's the knowing that it's going to happen eventually that I think is key, right? Because you
Mm.
have to have something that we always talk about this in context of, like, if you're going to build a new bridge,
Hmm.
and the bridge that is there is still in heavy use, but you know that you have to update it. Like,
Hmm.
what San Francisco did is they built a bridge directly next to the old Bay Bridge.
Hmm.
And then when that bridge was done, its time had come, and they ported everything over to the new bridge, and then they demolished the old one.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I read something very similar about like uh like transfer of power in elites in society, like throughout history. Again, it's like, it's kind of a cynical view for democracy, but it reads quite true to me, which is that, like, so just as a lens for making sense of like historical political changes and stuff, it's basically all like, so this model, I can't remember who pioneered it, but it's like, the invitation is to consider all of history as elite in intra rivalries between competing elite groups, and then whichever group sees that there's a moment of weakness in the existing elite, they will, manufacture whatever propaganda or whatever they need to win over broad, wider mainstream support. And I guess you could say the progress of democracy is that more and more ordinary people are involved in that conversation. So it used to be just like one set of, like, a king and his army, or like his handful of loyalists, and then another king and another handful of their loyalists. And now it's been broader and broader to include more and more strata of society. But yeah, it's very much the sense of the people who end up in leadership are the people who basically were like rehearsing for it the whole time, so that when the existing order falls, they're like ready right there just to move in. And sometimes like a lifetime goes by and like the window of opportunity never arises. So you never know, right? Like there could have been Napoleon tier individuals or Hamilton tier individuals that we'll never know about because there were no revolutions in their lifetime, right? So it's like only in such and I guess you could say that we seem to be living through very tumultuous times, which is a good time for ambitious people who want to rise quickly in whatever context. Interesting times for sure. I don't know how it's going to play out, but it's interesting. We'll see.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's funny how in science too, people will just come across the same ideas at the same time. You know, it's just like the world prepares the conditions for those thinkers who, like you said, are already hiding out in the underground at all times to just pop up and grab it because they're like, oh, okay, it's time to do my job. Yeah, it is terrifying as an artist to think that time to do your job might not show up, you know?
Yeah. But I mean, I do think, so I was reading once about, so yeah, another one of my long-term interests in parallel of all of this is just understanding like golden ages or like, flourishings of arts and science and all of those things. And like, if you read about, let's say you take the Florence Renaissance and the age of Da Vinci, like if you go back a little earlier, there were like a couple of guys in the late like 1200s ish or like 1100s. I can actually pull this up and see who I'm talking about so that I don't get my facts wrong. But like there were people who, there were like creatives who lived during the quote unquote so-called dark ages. And again, like modern historians are like, don't call it that. Sure.
A lot of bards, from what I understand. Just
so
people, minstrels.
Correct. Yeah, there were like, even in the worst of times, right? And like, so I guess saying what the worst of times is debatable. But like, even when times were not that great, there were always people who were trying to keep. So the shorthand I use for this, I call it the light of human consciousness. But it's just inquiry, curiosity. Like even when like Genghis Khan is like barreling through Baghdad and burning down everything. Like some of that survived, and some of the librarians and intellectuals or whoever, they managed to get some of that material to Venice, and then like if they had not done that, there would have been. And yeah, maybe we will never know what we don't know. We'll never know which libraries burned, and then we just never heard from it ever again. But so much, the fact that we do have as a species, we do have like an intellectual legacy and lineage, or like multiple legacies and lineages. That itself, I feel, is proof that there were always people who tried, and there were always, even in like the worst of times,